Hola, bienvenidos. Welcome everyone. Today we're going to explore a pivotal moment in the history of colonial Mexico, the Mixton War. It was not just a battle, it was a story of survival, courage, and of indigenous people defending their way of life and their land against overwhelming odds. By the end of this presentation, we will finally understand what this war was about, and why it happened, and how its legacy shaped Mexico and incoming rebellions. Most importantly, to understand this war, we need to understand who were the real players behind this. We're gonna start on one side, the indigenous warriors. Primarily, the ones who started this were the caxcanes tribe. They partnered up with the Zacaticos and the Ticohis and other nearby tribes as well. These groups shared strong cultural traditions and deep ties to their ancestral lands. They were united by one common purpose: to resist foreign domination against their land, against their land. Their main leader was a guy named Francesco Tenamastli. He was a prominent Gahakan chief. He became a symbol of defiance, respected not only as a warrior, but also as a voice for his people's dignity and survival. Let's see the opposite side now. Spanish forces on the other side had many people that were involved in this war. The first conquistador was somebody named Nuno de Guzman. We'll learn about him more in the later slides, but this guy, he first started this war in his ways of infamous for his cruelty and oppressive rule that made this war lead to what it is right now. Later, other figures joined the fight, such as Francesco Vasquez de Coronado, Antonio de Mendoza, Cristobal de Onat, and Pedro de Guzman. Together, they represented the full might of Spain's colonial expansion in Mexico and anywhere in the northern region of it. This picture shows Antonio de Mendoza. What was it about? Well, at its core, it was mainly a rebellion. Not just a random rebellion, but it was a direct response to Spanish attempts to expand into the northwestern regions of Mexico. For the Spanish, this war was about control and power, and their ability to get the resources, ability to get more land, more control, making those uncivilized nations into their submission. As for the indigenous people, mostly for the Gahakan tribe, it was survival. They weren't fighting for wealth or glory. They were fighting for their homeland, their freedom, and their preservation of their identity. They wanted their dignity more than anything else. Well, when did it happen? Well, this war formally took place between the years of 1540 and 1542. But however, the seeds of rebellion were planted much earlier than that. When Spanish forces came in 1529, when they launched violent attacks, destroyed many communities, harassed and created chaos in nearby regions. This brutality created deep resentment and planted the desire to build onto that resistance between those people and the rebellion, which ultimately started that war. Which was one of the reasons why Francesco wanted to fight back. By 1540, the Gahakan tribe and their allies could no longer tolerate the oppression that was going on. They launched a coordinated rebellion and many guerrilla attacks against nearby Spanish settlements and the soldiers and whoever was with them. For 2 years, non-stop, those brave soldiers, brave warriors fought valiantly. But, however, by 1542, the Spanish conquistadors brought overwhelming force, and ultimately it was the downfall of that rebellion. It fell into the hands of them. Well, why did it happen? And how did it happen? The reasons run deep. First of all, it was the loss of land. The Spanish viewed the indigenous territories as resources to be exploited. To the Caxcanes, these lands were sacred. These were homes of their ancestors, foundations of their cultures, and sources of survival. The second reason was it was literally a threat to their existence. If the Spanish came onto their land, they will no longer be existing on that land. The Spanish expansion meant forced labor, destruction of communities, and loss of self-determination. The people realized that if they did not resist, their way of life could vanish, like I said before. The third example of rebellion was the tyranny of leadership under Nuno de Guzman, which ultimately became a symbol of colonial cruelty amongst the indigenous people. His violence and exploitation provoked anger, defiance among these communities and the nearby regions. But however, under the leadership of Francesco Tenamastli, he organized guerrilla tactics and guerrilla attacks against the Spanish. They launched daring strikes, ambushes, and defensive battles. Even though they lacked the weapons and the numbers of the Spanish, they relied on the knowledge of the land and their tactics of warfare and their determination to survive to try to win this. Now, most importantly, where did this happen? Well, as the name is pretty obvious, the Mixton War, Mixton name itself gets the name from the hill called the Mixton Hill. It is mainly a rocky stronghold located in present-day Zacatecas, Mexico. This hill became the heart of the rebellion, mainly a fortress where indigenous warriors organized their defense. The main tribe, the caxcanes, lived across what is now the state of Jalisco, southern Zacatecas, and Aguascalientes. These regions were rugged and mountainous, providing natural defenses and strategic strategic defenses. But despite the geography, ultimately the Spanish forces, armed with the horses, steel, weapons, firearms, and their allies of other indigenous tribes, eventually overwhelmed the defenders. And now we will learn what happened on the aftermath of this war. By 1542, the war ended in tragedy for the indigenous people, and the Spanish successfully captured the hill and the other surrounding areas, bringing the rebellion and those to a halt. The consequences on the indigenous people were devastating. The community suffered the loss of identity, language, and many traditions. The survivors endured continued suppression under colonial rule. They also had they had to commit they had to go through on court systems and stuff like that just to see what their punishments were going to be. And on top of that, their generations in the future carried the weight of this defeat. Yet, this war had a lasting impact with the other regions nearby. The resistance inspired future uprising, most notably the Chichimeca War, which lasted from 1550 to 1590. The Mexican War mostly became a symbol and a reminder in which, in the face of overwhelming power, the indigenous people will still fight through their dignity and freedom no matter what, shaping other revolts against colonial suppression in the upcoming years. Now that is the end of this presentation, but it isn't the end yet. This war represents the enduring struggle of the indigenous people against colonial domination. And it also teaches us that the resistance is not just about winning or losing. It's about the courage to stand up for what is right, even when the odds are impossible. The caxcanes and their allies, what we can learn from them, is their legacy of resilience. Something that echoes through history, and it continues to inspire movements for justice and self-determination until to this day. I hope you guys like my presentation, and I'll see you guys in the next one.